friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum, and in today's video I want to talk to you guys about my favorite villains and antagonists in some books, as well as what makes a villain great for me. Villains are something that are pretty important to my reading experience. All of my favorites tend to have fairly compelling villain figures in them. And one of the biggest factors to how well a book will work for me is how tense and pulse pounding it is. And if we have a compelling villain in there, that's going to ratchet up the tension for sure. So definitely this is something I really tend to appreciate in a lot of the books that I love. And yeah, I figured it would be fun to dig into it with you guys today. So before I get going into any kind of examples of who my favorites are, I want to kind of touch on some of the factors that make a villain great for me. And the first one is that they are pretty competent. So they add a lot of tension to the plot because there's some risk involved. Like, they're not going to be easy to overcome. They're going to have some wins throughout the story. The author may have to inject some creative plot solutions to be able to overcome or negate some things that they're doing. They're definitely not useless. They're definitely not to be discounted. They are here and they are making their presence known and wreaking havoc. They're getting some wins for sure. So yeah, competent villain is a big factor for me. The second is, do they have any kind of nuance? Do I get any kind of understanding why they are the way they are? Why they're making the decisions that they're making? Do they have reasons for the choices that they're making? If we kind of dig a little bit deeper into a villainous character, and if they have a compelling kind of reason for all that, or if you got to see sort of why they became the way they did, those things are always interesting for me too. So yeah, nuance to the villain is definitely appreciated from me. And then the third kind of factor is, do I have some kind of visceral reaction to them? Now this one's a bit trickier to pin down because I don't know that there's always like key ingredients as to like why I may have a visceral reaction to them or why they may get under my skin. But something that almost always works for me is when they're really manipulative, but it's subtle to where not everyone will recognize how icky it is. Or a villain that kind of twists logic just enough to where like it sounds like it makes sense until you think about it and then you're like, wait a minute. It could also just be one that's doing really terrible things that is really wreaking havoc, and I am maybe invested in the characters that this is happening to, so that kind of will give me a visceral reaction. But yeah, those are kind of the three factors that really make me appreciate a villain, and there were kind of things I thought about as I was making my list of favorites today. So yeah, they're really competent, they have some kind of nuance, and they give me a visceral reaction. Before I get into like my top 10 favorites, I do kind of have a list of like the B list, if you will, so like a bunch of honorable mentions. So villains I enjoyed but that didn't quite live up to like all three criteria enough to make them like god tier. But I will quickly mention them because I did really enjoy the reading experience with them as well. And the first is Joe Goldberg from the You series by Caroline Kepnes. He is kind of a stalker figure. He has his own moral code and he definitely twists logic to suit his thought processes. So that's really interesting to kind of read about and unpack. The next one is President Snow from the Hunger Games series. He definitely is very like coercive, manipulative. That's something that gets under my skin, and definitely he's competent too. Like, he gets wins throughout the series. Intimidation is one of his tactics, and yeah, I definitely had a visceral reaction reading his scenes as well. Next up, I want to mention Hannah from Baby Teeth and Dear Hannah by Zoe Stage. And in Baby Teeth, she is a young girl, but she has issues communicating with her mom. They don't really understand each other. I'm blanking on the term for this, but she doesn't speak. So yeah, definitely they have misunderstandings. And in this book, you can see how that escalates. She definitely has some pretty competent moments, especially for a kid. And I definitely had a visceral reaction to kind of the mother and daughter's experiences in this story, as well as in Dear Hannah, where she's an adult and kind of moved on with her life too. If we're going visceral reaction, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention Dolores Umbridge from Harry Potter 5, The Order of the Phoenix. She is wreaking all kinds of havoc at Hogwarts at this point in the series, and definitely she is one of those villains I love to hate. She's not necessarily the most compelling villain that I can think of, but she's definitely one that gets a reaction from me. A series that I've read a ton of books from that has many villains is the Dresden Files, but my favorite Dresden villain is definitely Nicodemus. I find that he is one of the more competent ones. He's one of the ones that kind of affects the plot or adds the most tension to a plot for me. And so when I know that the Dresden installment I'm picking up is a Nicodemus one, definitely my interest is more piqued. And actually he features in my all-time favorite Dresden book, which is Small Favor, which I know is a bit of a hot take. And then the last sort of like B-list of villains book or series I want to shout out is The Song of the Shattered Sands by Bradley P. Beaulieu, starting with the 12 Kings and Cherokee. And this series is kind of rife with different antagonistic and villainous figures. But yeah, they are all interesting in their own right. There's some creatures that are wreaking havoc. The Kings and Cherokee are not the best people. You have more of a villainous figure that comes out throughout the series on top of that. And yeah, definitely some enjoyable antagonistic characters in here. Now that I've quickly touched on like my second tier villains, let's get into some of my all-time favorites and why they work for me so well. And the first one I want to talk about is Mr. Monster from Mr. Monster by Dan Wells. This is the second book in the John Cleaver series. And essentially in the John Cleaver series, you have John Cleaver, big shocker, right? And he's a young man whose family runs the local mortuary. And so he sees kind of a lot of death, but he's also very fascinated by serial killers. And in book one, you have a string of deaths, and he's trying to figure out what the heck is going on in town, why this is happening, and the story goes from there. But Mr. Monster, the second book, really was a step up above and beyond that for me. So in here, you have Mr. Monster, which I can't really tell you too much about, but I will say he is very interesting. I had never read a villain that had the abilities that this one did, and it led to some very interesting creative plot solutions. I didn't necessarily feel like he had a ton of nuance, or like I didn't necessarily understand all of his motivations, but he is one of the more competent villains that I've read about, and he definitely gave me a very visceral reaction, and I thoroughly enjoyed the reading experience of this book. This was a 5-star read for me, and probably the closest thing I have to an all-time favorite book in horror. This is a series that I wanted to binge for sure, but this one definitely stands out as my favorite because of the villain. The next villain I want to talk about is John Randall from the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. And essentially in here, you follow our main character, Claire, and through being curious about a Celtic ritual she's kind of overseeing, she ends up being sucked back in time. And this is kind of the story of her not really fitting in, but trying to navigate that situation and navigate life in this time period. I love her character for sure, but the villain in here, John Randall, who's part of the British Army, he is like an awful dude. He definitely gave me a very visceral reaction, and he also is very competent. He's definitely one of the more like sadistic, awful ones that I've read about, and man, did he have me more invested in this book series because of what he was up to. He adds so much tension to the plot in these books, and I definitely enjoy them a lot more for having him there. Next up, I want to touch on a recent read, and that is The Good Samaritan by John Marrs. And essentially in here, you have a woman who works at a suicide hotline, but her motivations for doing so are not altruistic. She actually enjoys hearing when people are spiraling when they are on the phone with her, and she kind of looks for opportunities to sort of have that happen. To say the least, she is an extremely unlikable character that you do not want to root for. But she's definitely a very competent villain. You see how this affects people. You end up getting to explore in here how she affects a lot of things, like her own family, the people she's on the phone with trying to help or not trying to help. And you do eventually get to dig into her personality and kind of her backstory and explore like what's going on in a deeper sense with her. So I definitely found that really interesting, and just the fact that she was so competent and gave me a visceral reaction had me really invested in this story. She definitely created so much tension through the plot of this, and I had a great time reading it. Next up, I want to talk about an unnamed villain in the Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy, and I'm holding up book 3, Gleam, because this book to me is kind of where things come to a head with this particular villain that I'm thinking about. And I'm not going to tell you who they are because it's kind of a mild spoiler for the series. Like, it's maybe something you could infer, but I don't want to give you too much detail because I think it's better not to know. So yeah, we're just going to say they're an unnamed villain. And this was kind of one of the most interesting tension-filled reading experiences I've had in a very long time because of how viscerally I reacted to this villain and what they were up to in here. They pulled off some things that were absolutely devastating to read about, especially how it impacted the characters that we were getting the perspectives from. And it was definitely really interesting to unpack not only the villain's backstory a little bit more in here, but also the backstory of the people that they're affecting a little bit more. I think that this story was kind of masterfully crafted in that way because the more information you got about everyone's backstory, the more tense it became because the more you realized how each unique aspect to how things were going in the plot were going to affect the characters on a deeper level because it touched on things that were either maybe like sensitive topics or things that related to their past. So this was definitely a very strong example of a villain that just got me. Like, I had such a visceral reaction to this villain by this point in the series that it was wild. I think it's rare for me to see an author really be as thoughtful with their villain as Raven Kennedy was in here. And so yeah, definitely I can say I really appreciate this for the villain. Next up, we're going to talk about one that you're probably wondering why it hasn't come up yet. It's kind of a very popular one to have a visceral reaction to, and that's going to be the Lannister family in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm holding up Game of Thrones because that's just the one I grabbed off the shelf. But I'm specifically kind of leaning more towards like Joffrey and Cersei in here. So one of the things that kind of always gets me to have a visceral reaction, like I said, is kind of a villain that is subtly manipulative, one that twists logic or twists morality to suit their own needs. And I feel like both Cersei and Joffrey fall into that in this series for sure. They both got under my skin in the best ways, and definitely they add so much to the reading experience of this series for me. I also thought it was interesting that you kind of had both a mother and a son exhibiting some of the like awful villainous traits and tendencies in here, and it was kind of interesting to kind of further dig into that and figure out, is this nature, is this nurture, kind of like what is the full picture here. But yeah, they were both really manipulative, they were both really selfish, they both wreaked havoc and added tension to the plot. I definitely appreciated the inclusion of both of them in this series. Speaking of villains that are really manipulative and that twist logic to suit their own needs and that are very kind of like subtly sneaky, but like also that give me a very visceral reaction, we've got to talk about Scythe Goddard in the Arc of a Scythe trilogy by Neal Shusterman. And essentially in here, you have a utopian society where nobody dies anymore, but the world is kind of plagued with overpopulation. And so there are these people appointed scythes who kind of go around and call the population a bit by performing some sanctioned killings to prevent some more serious global issues. And our main characters in book one are being apprenticed as scythes. So it's interesting to see kind of their experiences digging into everything, but when they kind of run into like the different moral codes and different ways that different scythes operate, and it becomes clear how Scythe Goddard really like manipulates and is very sneaky, he definitely gave me a very visceral reaction. I did also like that in further books in the series, you did get a bit more of kind of his backstory and maybe like why he opted to make the choices that he makes. And he was definitely adding a ton of tension to the story. He was very involved in the plot. So I definitely really enjoyed my reading experience of this trilogy for that reason. If you've seen my favorite sci-fi fantasy books, you will know that I will be remiss if I don't touch on this next one, and that is the Broken Empire series by Mark Lawrence, and specifically Jorg. He is the main character in here, and he is an awful dude, like completely terrible. He and his brotherhood, called the Road Brothers, are traveling around, wreaking havoc, burning villages, doing completely terrible things, destroying people's lives and livelihoods. Like, you name it, they're doing it, and it's not good. But I loved the reading experience of this series a lot. This is one where you really get to dig into Jorg's backstory throughout the series. You really kind of slowly piece together what has made him the way he is. Why is he shaped this way? What the heck is going on with him? And getting that kind of reading experience was really interesting for me. But even beyond that, like, he's not even the main villain of the series, which is wild. So having this other villain, which I'm not going to name because I feel like it's more fun to uncover on your own, was also really fun, added a lot of tension to the story, added a lot of like nuance and heartbreaking moments, and just had me all over the place emotionally. This was one of those reading experiences that, like, I don't think is going to work well for a lot of people, but it worked so well for me because of the villains in this series. And I definitely think Mark Lawrence pulled off something very special with this trilogy. Moving on to maybe a less offensive villain, I want to talk about some Brent Weeks characters. And the first of those is Andros Guile from the Lightbringer series. And kind of in this world, you have the Chromaria, which is kind of like the overseeing government. And the magic system is based on colors. So in this Chromaria, you have 7 seats plus the prism, and they're sort of the government that makes decisions for the world. And Andros is the red seat. So he's one of the 8 people in power in this society, and he is extremely manipulative and very sneaky, and he definitely gets some wins throughout the plot in these books. He always had me intrigued with what he was going to come up with or what he was going to pull into the plot next. And definitely I did not feel like I could let my guard down while I was reading chapters that involved him, because I just knew that he was going to do something that gave me a good reaction. I also thought it was really intriguing to kind of try and figure out why he was doing the things he was doing, or like what his motivations were. And you do get some kind of payoff and answers to that through the series too. So that was really neat. Mainly, I just love how much havoc he wreaked on the overall plot of this, and the visceral reaction I had to him because he is like so manipulative and so sneaky at times. And apparently Brent Weeks writing fantastic villains is a trend for me, because the next one I'm going to talk about is Roth, aka Rat, in the Night Angel series. And in here, our main character, Kylar or Azoth, depending on what identity he's assuming at the moment, is a street orphan, and he's kind of part of a street guild. And Roth, aka Rat, is kind of one of the like higher ups in this street guild, and definitely he does some very awful things. He's definitely one of the more like cunning and sadistic and just awful villains that I've read about. He definitely gave me a very visceral reaction. He added a lot of tension to the story for me. The characters are definitely reacting to what he's up to in here. And yeah, just a very compelling villain that definitely had some wins that definitely got under my skin. And then the last villain I want to talk about is another one from one of my all-time favorite books and series, and that is Aja O'Grimmess from the Red Rising series. And I'm holding up Golden Sun and Morningstar because I've so far only yet read through the end of Iron Gold. I was kind of putting off continuing until we got more of an announcement date for Red God. But anyways, Aja stands out to me in books 2 and 3 for sure. She was kind of one of the earlier introductions to a villain that I got, where the villain really kind of accomplished a lot throughout the series. She adds a huge element of tension and risk to the plots in these books. She definitely does some things that I was not happy about. But the reading experience of these stories were so much better for that, because that added so much tension and questioning into the plot of these. Like, I knew that nobody was safe, that I could not trust Pierce Brown to keep people safe, and that led to a really unpredictable, exciting reading experience for me. So definitely appreciate Aja and the other villains in these books as well, but Aja specifically stands out to me. So that was it for my favorite villains. Let me know down below in the comments, who have I missed? Who are some of your favorite villains? And do you have any other reasons or like things that make a villain interesting for you? I know I touched on them in the beginning of this video, what works for me. But yeah, let me know if you have any other thoughts to add. I would love to hear about your favorite villains as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye!